in the vast and terrible machinery of the Nazi concentration camp system, there existed institutions so dark, so deeply buried in shame, that for decades after the war they remained hidden from public knowledge. These were the camp brothels, establishments of forced prostitution, where women prisoners were exploited as instruments of control, manipulation, and profit. For more than 60 years, this chapter of Holocaust history remained largely unspoken. Survivors carried their trauma in silence. Documents remained classified. The perpetrators took their secrets to the grave. But history has a way of revealing even the most carefully concealed truths. This is the story of systematic sexual exploitation within the concentration camp system. It is a story of calculated cruelty, of survival under unimaginable conditions, and of the Nazi regime's willingness to weaponize every aspect of human existence, including intimacy itself, in service of their aims. By 1939, the outbreak of war had fundamentally transformed daily life across Nazi Germany. As military expansion accelerated and millions of men were mobilized for the Wehrmacht, a particular problem emerged, one that German military leadership took with unexpected seriousness. The absence of female companionship began to affect troop morale within the first months of the campaign. German commanders, viewing the situation through a coldly pragmatic lens, understood that this could have significant consequences. Discipline might suffer, dissatisfaction could spread, the fighting effectiveness of units could decline. For the military forces stationed across occupied territories, the solution was relatively straightforward, if morally reprehensible. The Wehrmacht established brothels in occupied zones, staffed by women deemed racially acceptable under Nazi ideology, primarily those classified as Aryan. These facilities served German soldiers, and military leadership considered the matter resolved. But the concentration camp system presented a different challenge entirely. In early 1942, a memorandum landed on the desk of Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS. The author was Oswald Pohl, a man whose name would become synonymous with the bureaucratic machinery of the Holocaust. Pohl held the position of chief of the SS main economic and administrative office, known by its German acronym, the WVHA. In this role, he commanded administrative authority over the entire concentration camp network. Pohl was not a sadist driven by ideology alone. He was something perhaps more dangerous, a technocrat who approached mass murder and exploitation with the mindset of a corporate efficiency expert. Pohl saw the concentration camps as economic enterprises that required optimization. Every aspect could be measured, calculated, improved. Prisoner labor had to be extracted with maximum efficiency. Resources had to be allocated rationally, and prisoners themselves had to be controlled through the most effective means available. It was through this calculating lens that Pohl identified what he saw as an opportunity. The male prisoners in the concentration camps, Pohl reasoned, also lacked physical intimacy. What if this fundamental human need could be transformed into a tool of control? What if access to sexual contact could be used as a reward system, a means of incentivizing cooperation and productivity? More importantly, what if it could be used to create divisions among prisoners, to build hierarchies that would make them easier to manage and manipulate? Pohl detailed his proposal with characteristic thoroughness. His memorandum to Himmler laid out the concept in clinical, bureaucratic language, the language of efficiency and system optimization, stripped of any acknowledgement of the human cost. Himmler reviewed the proposal. He approved it. In June 1942, The first concentration camp brothel opened in Mauthausen, one of the most brutal camps in the Nazi system, located in Austria. Pohl approached the project with the same methodical precision he applied to all aspects of camp administration. Every detail was calculated. The ratios were determined mathematically. How many women would be required to service how many men? Age ranges were established based on assessments of physical endurance. The number of rooms needed for continuous operation was computed. Even the expected lifespan of a woman under these conditions was factored into the planning. The resulting calculations were as cold as they were precise. 10 women were selected to provide services to between 300 and 500 male prisoners. Each calculation was based on estimates of maximum physical endurance, how much abuse a woman's body could withstand before failing to meet production targets. If a selected woman could not fulfill the quota assigned to her, she was returned to the general camp population. The women were sourced primarily from Ravensbrück, the largest concentration camp for women in the Nazi system. The selection process was overseen at times by Maria Mandl, a notorious female SS supervisor whose cruelty would later make her one of the most wanted war criminals. The women chosen came from different backgrounds. They had been imprisoned for various reasons under Nazi persecution: political resistance, being labeled asocial, criminal convictions under unjust laws, or simply being in the wrong place under occupation. Now they faced a terrible choice that was hardly a choice at all. The Mauthausen experiment, from Pohl's perspective, succeeded beyond expectations. Prisoner behavior began to shift in ways that benefited the SS administration. Reports documented a significant increase in prisoners informing on one another, reporting escape plans, identifying resistance leaders, betraying fellow inmates in hopes of gaining privileges. Work productivity among prisoners with access to the facility increased measurably. The promise of sexual contact proved to be a powerful motivator, just as Pohl had predicted. Triumphant, Pohl expanded the program. Additional camp brothels were established at Gusen, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, and several other major concentration camps. By the end of the program, 10 camps in total had been equipped with such facilities. The supply of women posed no obstacle. Maria Mandl and other female overseers at Ravensbrück ensured a steady stream of prisoners for this purpose. Through this system, Pohl created a hierarchy of privilege among prisoners that served the SS perfectly. Access to these facilities was restricted to certain categories of inmates, those who held positions of authority within the prisoner structure. Capos, prisoner foremen, barracks leaders, and others who collaborated with camp administration were granted this privilege. This restriction served multiple purposes. First, access required payment. Prisoners had to have acquired camp currency through their work or collaboration, making the service only available to those with means. Second, it created a visible symbol of status that other prisoners could aspire to, incentivizing cooperation with the SS. Most significantly, Jews were categorically excluded from access under any circumstances. While documentation remains incomplete, many historians believe this prohibition came directly from Himmler himself, reflecting the regime's obsessive racial ideology. Even in the midst of exploitation, Nazi racial hierarchy was rigidly maintained. The camp brothel system served another purpose in the minds of SS administrators. Among male prisoners confined for years without contact with women, relationships between men had naturally developed in some cases. The SS viewed this through their characteristic lens of utility rather than morality. Despite the Nazi regime's persecution of homosexual men, thousands were imprisoned and murdered. The practical concern within the camps was not ideological but medical. Men engaging in same-sex relations could potentially spread venereal diseases, which posed a practical problem for camp productivity and could spread to the wider prisoner population. The regime's response was characteristically brutal. Prisoners suspected of such relations were subjected to forced medical treatment. If treatment failed, or if the prisoner was deemed beyond rehabilitation, execution often followed. The establishment of brothels was intended, in part, to redirect prisoners towards heterosexual relations that the SS could monitor and control more effectively. Over the course of the war, between 300 and 500 women passed through the 10 camp brothels. Documentary evidence reveals that approximately 65% were German nationals, with Polish women comprising most of the remainder, and at least one Romanian woman among them. For these women, conditions were degrading beyond description, yet paradoxically offered marginally better chances of survival than the general camp population faced. Each woman was required to service up to 8 men daily. Each encounter was limited to 15 minutes, precisely timed. Privacy did not exist. Every room was equipped with peepholes through which SS guards monitored activities. Conversation during encounters was strictly forbidden, preventing any human connection or exchange of information that might undermine camp security. Before beginning their assignments, women underwent extensive medical examinations. The SS needed to ensure they were disease-free and physically capable of performing as required. After selection, they received what the administration termed rehabilitation: calcium injections, skin treatments with harsh brushes, disinfecting baths, enhanced rations compared to other prisoners, and exposure to ultraviolet lamps. The most invasive measure was forced sterilization, performed to ensure that pregnancy would not interfere with the woman's availability for service. The Nazi medical establishment, already deeply implicated in crimes against humanity, applied its expertise to maximizing exploitation. The daily reality was humiliating, traumatic, and dehumanizing. Yet for women in the concentration camps, where starvation, disease, random murder, and selection for death were constant threats, assignment to these facilities could represent a marginally better chance of survival. The women received better food than other prisoners. They were housed in slightly better conditions. They were valuable to the SS for a specific purpose, which meant they were less likely to be killed arbitrarily or worked to death through hard labor. The statistics bear this out grimly. Nearly all of the women who served in these facilities survived the war, a survival rate dramatically higher than that of the general camp population. This does not minimize the horror of their experience. It simply reflects the terrible calculus of survival in a system designed to destroy human beings. The SS employed psychological manipulation as ruthlessly as physical force. Women assigned to these facilities were subjected to ideological conditioning designed to extract compliance. They were told repeatedly that if they performed their duties diligently for 6 months, meeting quotas, following rules, maintaining their health, they might be released. Freedom would be their reward for cooperation. Few believed these promises. Experience had taught concentration camp prisoners that SS promises were meaningless. But hope is difficult to extinguish completely, even in the darkest circumstances. Some allowed themselves to hope, however faintly. And so women agreed, not because they truly believed liberation awaited them, but because the alternative was worse, because refusing meant certain return to the hell of the general camp population, because in a world of impossible choices, this seemed like the least impossible option. The camp brothels operated continuously from 1942 until the end of the war in 1945. They were disbanded only when the concentration camps themselves were liberated or evacuated as Allied forces advanced. After the war, a profound silence descended over this chapter of history. The reasons for this silence were multiple and complex. For the women who survived, the trauma was immense and the stigma overwhelming. In post-war society, even survivors of forced prostitution faced judgment and shame. Many chose never to speak of their experiences, carrying the burden alone. For Germany, confronting the full scope of Nazi crimes was a painful process that unfolded over decades. Some aspects of Holocaust history received extensive documentation and acknowledgement relatively quickly. Others remained buried under layers of shame, denial, and selective memory. These were uncomfortable truths. For decades, they remained largely unexamined. In 2009, more than 6 decades after the end of the war, German historian Robert Sommer published a book that finally broke the silence. The work was titled Das KZ Bordell, the concentration camp brothel. Sommer had spent 34 years researching this hidden aspect of Holocaust history, painstakingly tracking down documents, interviewing survivors who were willing to speak, and reconstructing the historical record. The resulting work spanned more than 450 pages of meticulously documented history. Names, dates, locations, administrative orders, personal testimonies. Sommer laid bare the complete history of the camp brothel system. His research definitively debunked myths that the Nazi regime had opposed prostitution on moral grounds. On the contrary, the evidence showed that the regime had systematically legalized, organized, and exploited prostitution as a tool of control and profit. The Nazis had killed 2 birds with 1 stone, as the saying goes. They extracted economic value from the system. Prisoners paid for access with camp currency they had earned through labor. And simultaneously, they created a powerful mechanism of manipulation, controlling prisoners through their most basic physical and emotional needs. Sommer's research provided detailed documentation of the forced nature of this prostitution. Women prisoners were coerced into these roles through the circumstances of their imprisonment, the threat of worse conditions, and false promises of reward. The choice they faced was not a true choice at all. His work depicted the Third Reich leadership in an even more negative light than previous scholarship had managed. It revealed another dimension of Nazi cruelty, the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability and need as instruments of oppression. For some women, serving in these facilities had been a survival strategy in an environment where every day brought the possibility of death. They made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and they deserve recognition not as collaborators, but as victims who endured yet another form of Nazi cruelty. The story of the concentration camp brothels illuminates several crucial aspects of Nazi ideology and the Holocaust that remain relevant to historical understanding. First, it demonstrates the totalitarian nature of Nazi control. The regime sought to dominate not merely the physical existence of prisoners, but every aspect of their humanity, including their intimate lives, their emotional needs, and their basic human dignity. Nothing was considered off-limits if it could serve the purposes of the state. Second, it reveals the intersection of exploitation and extermination that characterize the concentration camp system. These were not merely death camps, though death was omnipresent, They were also sites of economic exploitation, where prisoners were used as resources to be extracted, optimized, and discarded when their utility ended. Third, it shows how the Nazis created hierarchies among victims, turning oppressed groups against one another and incentivizing collaboration through systems of privilege and deprivation. This divide-and-rule strategy was essential to maintaining control over large prisoner populations with relatively small numbers of guards. Fourth, the camp brothel system exemplifies the Nazi regime's willingness to sacrifice its own stated ideological principles when practical considerations demanded it. Despite public campaigns against prostitution and moral decay, the regime institutionalized forced prostitution on a systematic scale when it served their purposes. Finally, the decades of silence surrounding this topic remind us that historical memory is selective and contested. Some atrocities receive immediate acknowledgement and memorialization. Others remain hidden for generations, sometimes because they make us more uncomfortable, sometimes because the victims are marginalized even within victim groups, sometimes simply because confronting them requires courage that societies take time to develop.
The concentration camp brothels represent one of the darkest corners of a system built on darkness. They stand as testament to the Nazi regime's limitless capacity for exploitation and cruelty, and to their willingness to corrupt even the most intimate aspects of human existence in service of control and profit. For the women who endured this exploitation, survival came at a terrible cost. Many never spoke of their experiences, carrying their trauma in isolation until death. Those who did speak often faced disbelief or judgment rather than compassion. Only through the painstaking work of historians like Robert Sommer has this hidden history finally come to light. His research has ensured that these women's suffering is acknowledged as part of the historical record, and that their stories contribute to our understanding of the Holocaust's full scope. As we confront this history, we are reminded that the Nazi regime's evil extended into every aspect of life within their reach. They industrialized murder. They commodified human bodies. They weaponized human needs and desires, and they left scars that remain visible generations later. The camp brothel system was not an aberration or an excess committed by rogue individuals. It was a deliberate, calculated policy developed at the highest levels of SS administration and approved by Heinrich Himmler himself. It was Nazi evil operating with characteristic bureaucratic efficiency. Remembering this history serves multiple purposes. It honors the memory and suffering of the women who were exploited. It deepens our understanding of how totalitarian systems function. It reminds us that cruelty can be banal and bureaucratic, hidden behind administrative language and justified by claims of efficiency and practicality. Most importantly, it stands as a warning. When human beings are reduced to resources, when their dignity is stripped away, when systems of control seek to dominate every aspect of existence, these are the results. The camp brothel system was not merely about sexual exploitation. It was about total control, total dehumanization, and the corruption of everything human for the purposes of an inhuman ideology. We remember so that history does not repeat. We document so that denial becomes impossible. We honor the victims so that their suffering was not meaningless, and we confront even the most uncomfortable truths, because that is what genuine historical reckoning requires. Subscribe to the channel.